Welcome to today's deep dive. I mean, if you're joining us, you're probably the kind of person who really appreciates dissecting complex systems.
Right, looking for those distinct aha moments.
Exactly. That one specific piece of insight that it completely shifts your perspective on something you thought you understood.
And today we are looking at something that really does that.
We are. We have a highly focused, deeply conceptual excerpt today. It's from an essay by Jaime Hoerricks, PhD.
But the title alone is great, Internal Architecture, where autism ends and language begins.
Yeah, and it specifically addresses this massive conflict, the overlap, the divergence, and really the inherent problems of behavioral language models.
It's a really dense, provocative text. We're looking directly at a foundational conflict here,
Right.
one that plays out every single day in clinics, in schools, institutional settings. The core of Dr. Hoerricks' argument centers on a massive conceptual misunderstanding.
Okay, let's unpack this because, we're dealing with diagnostic criteria, language acquisition, autism topics you, our listener, are likely pretty well versed in.
Yeah, we all know the basics of those.
Right. We all know that diagnostic manuals like the DSM are essentially outward behavioral checklists.
They describe what you can see.
Exactly. But Dr. Hoerricks makes this brilliant point about how institutions suffer from a sort of, institutional amnesia about that fact.
Yes, they start treating the map as the territory.
Yes.
Which is actually the perfect way to frame our goal for today. We need to look past the surface of those diagnostic criteria to understand the mechanics of that institutional amnesia.
Unpack how they view language.
Exactly. Reevaluating how institutions view language and, by extension, how they interact with the actual individuals utilizing that language.
Right, because it requires a rigorous distinction between an outward action that you can just observe and an inward cognitive structure that you actually have to understand.
I really appreciate how this essay forces a structural reevaluation.
It's big.
It is. It's not just about updating a definition. It's about questioning the entire epistemological stance of the institutions themselves.
Because we trust these diagnostic landscapes to be comprehensive.
We do. But Hoerricks challenges the utility of how we read them.
So let's just dive right into the first major paradigm shift that the text demands.
Okay.
It's regarding how we view the diagnostic manuals themselves.
The text basically asks us to completely reconsider their operational function.
Right.
We have to strip away the assumption that a diagnostic criterion is an explanation of a person's cognition.
Which is huge because, as we noted, we already know they are outward checklists. They record what a clinician can reliably see from the outside.
Across many different individuals.
Right, a recognizable pattern. But the text introduces a totally different framework for how we should be interacting with those observations.
It suggests treating them strictly as field notes.
Field notes, instead of definitive conclusions.
What's fascinating here is how that simple semantic shift completely alters the power dynamic.
From diagnosis to field notes.
Right. Think about the administrative reality of a verdict versus a field note.
Okay, yeah.
A verdict is a closed case. In an institutional database, a diagnostic code functions as a verdict.
It's final.
It tells the institution, we observed the behavior, we categorized it into a syndrome, and the investigation of the underlying mechanism is functionally over.
But wait, let me play devil's advocate for a second here.
Sure.
Institutions need standardized metrics, right? They need those ICD codes and DSM categories to provide care, secure funding, allocate resources.
Of course.
So if we treat every diagnostic interaction as this open-ended field note, how does a clinician or a school administration actually provide practical, scalable support?
Well, that is the exact friction the text is pointing toward. Hoerricks isn't arguing against the existence of standardized metrics.
Okay.
The critique is aimed at the institutional posture toward those metrics. A field note doesn't negate the observation.
Right. The behavior still happened.
Exactly. When a scientist takes field notes, they're recording empirical data. But the inherent assumption of a field note is that there is an entire complex ecosystem operating underneath that observation.
One that just hasn't been fully mapped yet.
Precisely. The institutional failing occurs when the administrative need for a verdict overrides the clinical need for ongoing inquiry.
Ah, I see where you're going. So the issue isn't the manual itself.
Yeah.
It's the finality with which institutions apply it.
Right.
When you treat diagnostic observations as field notes, you're forced to acknowledge that a behavioral criterion is not a final judgment on a person's neurocognitive reality.
It's merely a description of surface-level friction.
Surface-level friction, I like that. And more importantly, that description of behavior holds clues to the actual internal mechanics.
And then shifts the institutional stance from one of finality to one of necessary curiosity.
Yes.
If the manual is just field notes, then the behaviors it lists are not the defining characteristics of the individual's mind.
They're the external symptoms of a specific internal structure.
An internal structure interacting with an environment that might not accommodate it.
Okay, let's ground this in the specifics provided by the source, because Dr. Hoerricks outlines a very specific set of these outward behavioral patterns.
The exact things clinicians look for.
Right, the things they code into their systems. What exactly are these field notes recording?
We should definitely break down these observable patterns, because understanding how institutions view these surface behaviors is essential to grasping the architectural conflict we'll get into later.
So the first pattern the text lists is differences in conversational rhythm.
Which is very common.
Yeah, in a clinical setting, this is simply the observation of the back and forth pacing. A clinician notes the pauses, the cadence, or a rhythm that deviates from neurotypical expectations.
It's an audible outward metric.
Completely. And notice the institutional lens there.
Right. The clinician doesn't necessarily need to understand the cognitive processing speed or the linguistic parsing happening internally.
They just check the box that says the rhythm is different.
Exactly.
Then the source lists repeated language. You hear a phrase repeated, often referred to clinically as echolalia, and you mark it down.
And the third pattern is literal interpretation of figurative speech.
Oh, the classic scenario.
Right. Where a metaphor or an idiom is parsed at absolute face value by the individual.
I want to pause on that literal interpretation for a moment, actually.
Sure.
Because it perfectly illustrates the behavioral versus cognitive divide. Through a purely behavioral lens, a literal interpretation is almost always logged as a deficit.
A failure to grasp social nuance.
Exactly. But if we are treating this as a field note, we have to ask why the language is being parsed that way.
It points to a different semantic processing mechanism, not just a missing skill.
That is such a crucial distinction. It's not a void, it's a different system.
And the final set of patterns explicitly listed in the text are distinctive ways of responding to sensory environments and social contexts.
So this encompasses the visual, physical, or verbal reactions to complex social expectations or specific sensory inputs.
Right. So to recap, we have conversational rhythm, repeated language, literal interpretation, and distinctive sensory and social responses.
When an institution looks at that list, the administrative reflex is to view them as a cluster of symptoms.
Symptoms to be managed.
Right. But if we apply the field notes perspective, we recognize these interactive behaviors as friction points.
They are the outward manifestations of a distinct underlying cognitive framework operating below the surface.
Here's where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
Because Dr. Hoerricks doesn't just critique the behavioral model. The essay actually introduces the central thesis by drawing a sharp line between two distinct concepts.
This is really the pivot point of the whole text.
It is the pivot point of this entire deep dive. The text defines the terms in a way that forces a complete reevaluation of institutional language models.
So what are the two concepts?
Concept 1. Autism describes behavioral patterns, the rhythm, the repetition, the sensory responses. That is the behavior.
Okay.
Concept 2. Gestalt processing describes language architecture.
That is a stark contrast.
I really want to emphasize that distinction for you listening. Autism describes behavioral patterns, while Gestalt processing describes language architecture.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we really have to understand what Gestalt processing actually entails in this context.
Right, to see why the institutional friction is so severe.
We keep saying Gestalt processing is the architecture, but let's break down what that blueprint actually looks like compared to what institutions expect.
Because if we don't define it, internal architecture just becomes another buzzword.
Exactly.
If I'm a Gestalt processor, how is my linguistic blueprint fundamentally different from the standard institutional expectation?
Well, while the source focuses heavily on the structural divergence, we know from the context of language acquisition that standard institutional models are built on analytic processing.
Analytic processing. Learning language from the bottom up.
Right. Starting with individual sounds, then single words, then stringing those words together to build sentences.
It's highly modular. Building blocks.
Yes, a modular architecture. But Gestalt processing works differently.
It processes language in chunks.
Exactly. Gestalt architecture means acquiring and processing language in whole international phrases.
Gestalts.
Yes, the gestalts come first. The individual takes in the entire chunk of language, often tied to the emotional context or the sensory experience of when they first heard it.
So they aren't building sentences word by word initially,
No, they're utilizing complete complex scripts.
which perfectly explains the repeated language pattern we discussed earlier.
It does.
When an institution observes that repeated language, they're looking through an analytic lens. They see someone repeating a phrase, and because it doesn't fit the bottom-up model,
They label it as an aberrant behavior.
a symptom.
That is the core institutional misunderstanding Dr. Hoerricks highlights. The institution sees a behavior to be extinguished or modified.
But in reality, they are looking at a perfectly valid, functioning Gestalt language architecture.
The repeated phrase isn't a meaningless behavior. It's a foundational building block of that person's cognitive language structure.
Let's really analyze the friction that creates. The text states that misunderstanding arises when institutions treat language primarily as behavior.
Which they do, constantly.
If Gestalt processing is an internal, structural way that a mind builds and understands language, and a speech pathology paradigm or a behavioral therapy completely misses that,
The fallout is massive.
it has to be.
It's systemic. Think about it. Institutions are fundamentally designed to manage behaviors.
They utilize rubrics to modify, correct, or redirect behaviors to fit a standard, predictable mold.
Right. So if you take an internal language architecture, a structural cognitive reality, and you treat it primarily as a behavioral issue,
You are making a profound categorical error.
you are attempting to correct a person's neurocognitive operating system using behavior modification tools.
That is wild. You can't fix an operating system with behavioral reprimands.
And that leads to the divergence Hoerricks mentions. The behavior and the architecture overlap, certainly.
Because the observable repeated language is the outward expression of the Gestalt architecture.
Exactly. But they diverge entirely in how they must be addressed clinically and educationally.
You observe the behavior, but you must support the architecture.
Yes. When institutions fail to see the architecture and only manage the behavior, that divergence becomes a vast chasm of misunderstanding.
Think about the...
Absolutely. Yeah. If the institution sees a delayed pause as a behavioral noncompliance or a processing failure,
Rather than the time required for a Gestalt processor to parse and retrieve a complex linguistic chunk.
right, the institutional response will be to pressure the individual to speak faster.
It's a complete invalidation of their internal reality.
It is.
If the criteria used to identify autism were never designed to explain cognition, but institutions use those outward behavioral metrics to dictate language intervention.
They are essentially trying to rewrite a structural blueprint by erasing the surface data.
That is such a powerful way to put it. That is the ultimate danger of relying solely on the outward administrative view.
When an institution conflates architecture with behavior, it isn't just a minor academic oversight.
It dictates everything. It dictates the type of therapies approved by insurance.
It dictates the goals written into a student's individualized education program.
It fundamentally misinterprets how a person interacts with the world, taking their valid internal structure and reducing it to a behavioral checklist that needs to be fixed.
I think we have to ask why this happens so consistently.
Yeah, why is it so difficult for massive, well-funded institutions to pivot from a behavioral model to an architectural one?
Part of it is the legacy of behavioral psychology. Historically, it prioritized observable data over internal cognitive states.
Because observable data is easier to measure.
Easier to measure, easier to graph, easier to fund.
Right. An analytic language model is highly linear, which makes it very easy to test.
Whereas Gestalt processing is context-heavy, emotional, and nonlinear in its early stages.
It defies easy institutional standardization.
It really does. Which brings us right back to the beginning. The diagnostic manuals are built to record reliable, observable patterns. They're tools of observation.
Tools of observation. But the institutional failure occurs when we ask a tool of observation to act as a comprehensive map of human cognition.
We confuse the field notes for the territory itself.
And when you look through a purely behavioral lens at an architectural reality, the entire picture is distorted.
You apply the wrong support systems.
You set expectations that are completely misaligned with the individual's cognitive framework.
Exactly.
Let's synthesize the journey we've taken through Dr. Hoerricks' work today.
We covered a lot of ground.
We did. We started by examining the standard diagnostic criteria that institutions rely on, and rather than accepting them as final, comprehensive verdicts of a person's mind, We reframe them.
Reframe them as external field notes, simple records of outward interaction.
We noted that those field notes consistently record specific patterns, differences in conversational rhythm, repeated language, literal interpretations, and unique sensory responses.
But the critical pivot was recognizing that those observable patterns, the behavioral manifestations often labeled as autism, are merely surface-level clues.
Right. They point to a distinct underlying structure, which the text identifies as gestalt processing, the actual language architecture.
The grand tragedy and the massive conflict we explored is the systemic friction that occurs here.
When institutions look at that complex internal architecture and treat it merely as an aberrant behavior to be managed or extinguished,
This raises an important question for anyone engaged in clinical, educational, or even interpersonal observation.
it really challenges our fundamental critical thinking.
When we observe a communication pattern that deviates from the analytic norm, are we stopping at the behavioral observation?
Or are we capable of using that observation as a clue to understand, respect, and support a deeper, distinct cognitive architecture?
It fundamentally changes how you analyze interactions. You stop looking for deficits and start looking for the structural logic behind the communication.
And as we conclude today's deep dive, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over on your own.
A really profound one.
It builds directly on Dr. Hoerricks' critique of behavioral models, but pushes it to its logical and perhaps unsettling conclusion.
Okay.
If our institutional diagnostic manuals only function as field notes recording external behaviors, how much of a person's rich underlying internal architecture is going completely unseen and unsupported by the very experts tasked with understanding them?
That is a reality we must continue to interrogate.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive today. We hope this exploration challenged your perspective and provided that next aha moment. Stay curious, and we will catch you next time.